I'm an anthropologist, and Lynn was asking me if that meant that I paid attention to animals or not, or just humans, and I said, I work with hunters. I work with people who live in forests. They know a whole lot about animals, and so I'm really interested in what they know as well. And for several years, I organized a interchange between kids from the North Slope, the Inuit kids on the North Slope of Alaska, with Zapotec kids from the mountains of Mexico. And one year, one group of kids would go to the other place and stay in families and work with scientists and work with local knowledgeable people. And the next year, they'd go to the other place. So over the course of that, I was working with a lot of scientists. So have been combining the knowledge of the scientists around me with the hunters around me, some of whom are the same person. No? So I'm not making a division between something that's traditional knowledge and something that's modern scientific knowledge. I'm just interested in how people know stuff about the world. Yeah? Okay, so one of the things when Sandy invited me to come back, you know, I've been thinking a lot, because a lot of people are thinking a lot about resilience, about how people respond to the conditions of their life. And of course up in Barrow, Alaska, which is right up there on the very top. It's the northernmost permanent community on our continent. The conditions are very extreme, and the whole question about what contributes to your survival is an issue that's on everybody's lips. So is climate change. No, because the climate is changing faster at the poles than it's changing in the middle. So I've never gotten into an argument with anybody up in Barrow about whether it's happening. Got lots of conversations about why it might be happening, but whether it's happening, As a matter of fact, the first time I ever heard about this stuff was in the 90s, and what I was hearing from whalers was, there's something going on with our ice that we don't understand, because it's not acting in ways that we can understand. We can't predict what's. This is when a whole bunch of people were out on the ice doing spring whaling, and all of a sudden a chunk of it broke off and started to float gently towards Siberia. 147 people on that. Well, they were really, really lucky, because the North Slope Emergency Services was able to get them in zero visibility conditions. There was not any loss of life. There was a loss of equipment, which costs a lot, but nobody got hurt. And so then people were talking about what a miracle it was. And then I started hearing some whaling captains going, but I didn't go out then. Of course I wouldn't let my crew go out, because the wind had gone down. And I thought, the wind dies down and it becomes more dangerous? That's when I learned that the winds go one direction and the current goes another direction. So if the wind stops, then the current just lifts the stuff off. And so, well, I've been there for 7 or 8 years. That was a completely new idea for me. So that's one of the things for me that is incredibly interesting about what I do, is it's never boring. I'm constantly learning new stuff. Huge amount of it has to do with how it is that people think about what's going on around them and what they should be doing there. So it's a land of extremes. Can you see, Sandy?
Yes, I can.
That was a photo taken by one of my students at 11 o'clock at night in June. So it's midnight sun. I think it's a gorgeous photograph. Very pleased she gave it to me. And that is sort of what Barrow, I was last in Barrow in November. I was there for Thanksgiving this year. And in December is the land of not the midnight sun, but the midday dark. Yeah. That's an aerial picture of Barrow itself, and you can see how exposed it is. It's just completely flat. Well, that means the winds come from Siberia, basically knock everything over, and then the waves come crashing through. It is a very exposed place. So when we're thinking about extremes, I don't want to wander out of here, but I don't want to be in your way.
No.
When we're thinking about extremes, the first thing you need to think about are these extremes of light and dark. Yeah, because that's not going to be affected by climate change. No matter what, you're going to have half of the year when you have about 6 months of the year when there's either almost entire darkness or 24 hours of light. And then you have the other 6 months kind of medium. But those are constants. The temperature can be very cold, but it's not as cold as the interior. And I think the mean temperature annually is -9, so you're not gonna put on your bathing suit. But what it is it's the wind chill. When I was talking to you about the wind coming from Siberia, the wind chill can take the temperatures down to like -80. You don't go out unless you're really carefully protected. And what that's going to affect is what can grow on the tundra. Because what grows are these little tiny bushes that can kind of escape the most ferocity of the winds. So you get wind chill isn't just a sort of imaginary. Precipitation, they only get 6 inches of rain or precip in a year. We get 46 here. Yeah, so it's a serious factor. So all of those factors contribute to what might be considered to be extreme conditions, and we're not talking about change yet, okay? So that leads to what gets called a minimalist ecosystem. And I put these two images up because if you take a leg off of a centipede, it might get irritated, but it's not gonna really change its movement much because it's got so many of them. Whereas if you take a leg off of a dog, we all know dogs who are valiant and heroic and lose a leg and still learn how to do all that stuff, but it's a huge impact. Yeah. So when you're talking about systems that only have a few moving parts, you change one bit and there's a major impact. If you've got 1 billion moving parts and you change something, you hardly notice it for a while. When I first went to Mexico, mega biodiverse, the guys who were taking care of the forest said, no, I don't think so. We're not noticing anything. Last time I was there, they said we've lost half of our insects. Yeah, but you have to lose, and part of that mega biodiversity are the numbers of insects. So to lose half of them, you're going to know. To lose 2 or 3 species, So up there in the Arctic, it's a minimal system so that every change feeds its way through and people can notice it. So to think about humans, it means that you're always getting ready to think about the conversations that I've had with hunters, because the Inuit that I work with they call themselves whalers, but they hunt everything. They hunt caribou, they hunt geese, they fish, they hunt. If it's edible, they'll go after it, yeah, because it's their living. And we'll think about what kind of social relations they're in and with those animals. But what they say is, you never know what's going to happen, so you have to be flexible. You can't just say, these are the rules. We were taught by our elders that these are the rules. This is what we have to do. You don't get that. Lots of times I would go in to a house, for instance, and see Raymond cooking dinner, and I'd say, how come you're cooking? I thought that was your wife's job. He'd say, for survival. You break your rules for survival. That the survival is the most important thing. So you got to be flexible. You got to be alert. You have to be observant. You have to be prepared, and you really, really, really can't try to go it alone. It's not being brave to go it alone. It's being stupid. I'm quoting here. Yeah? Okay. So, but those are very important ideas to keep in mind when you're thinking about how people are confronting the conditions of life that somehow are difficult to really predict. And we're confronting with that, all of us, all the time. So I'm going to talk about 4 ways. Move it or lose it. That's migration. Hunker down and go with the flow. That's a kind of adaptation. Or change your behavior. It's another form of adaptation. Or change your species being, which we'll come back to. Now this really, I'm taking from a book that I just found. I think it was a 2021 publication, Hurricane Lizards and Plastic Squid. It's a wonderful book, which is why I thought I'd show the cover to it. It's written by a conservation biologist, and he's looking at plasticity as the capacity for changing. Yeah. And these hurricane lizards are a particular species that living in an area where the intensification of hurricanes was really notable, they changed their legs. They started to, the ones that survived had shorter legs, so their shorter legs could hang on to the trees better than the longer legs. And this happened over the course of a few years. Yeah. So his exploration is an exploration in survival. And he's in part talking about climate change, but he's also talking about how climate change may or may not be a change in a different kind of change. May just be sort of an intensification, but in any case, he's looking at all kinds of species, at how survival happens when you might not expect it to. Super interesting book. So to go back to the Arctic, that's an aerial view of a pod of bowhead whales that are migrating south. And the thing that's really interesting about that is what you see up here are the moms with some of their young. Their young stay with the mothers for well over a year. And these are the big guys coming up at the end, kind of guarding things. So when Inupiat are going whaling in the fall, they never go after the first whales they see. Because they say, no, you can't really tell by looking at a whale whether it's a male or a female. But if you know the pattern, then you know that the risk of taking down a mother with young is much higher if you go after that first chunk. So you wait for the larger whales coming up in the rear. Which is how I first started learning about the whale migration patterns. It was through these conversations of what kind of care you take to make sure that what you're doing is, in today's speak, sustainable. I think that the hunters I was talking about just talk about respectful. What you got? Birds, masses of birds. So one way that happens is that the movement out of the North Slope in September and October is just this whoosh of stuff all the time. But there are a lot of species, or a number of species, that just hunker down. So that's what I was talking about, that second option. I love these owls. The tundra has no trees, so they're kind of perched on the little hillocks, and you sort of go walking, and you see these punctuation marks of white that are these owls. But this is what's amazing. So here's this owl. They've got the bright color. Yeah, they're not going to stand out in the winter. Those feathers are fabulous insulation, so they stay warm. Everybody, all of us know about how keen the eyesight is for owls now and how they can do all their stuff. I'm not sure that you know, I didn't know about their ears. You look at this. They're not evenly. This guy is higher than that guy. And what it does is it allows the owl to sort of operate as an echo chamber. They can hear, like from 5 miles away, a lemming waking up and starting to run around underneath the snow. So that is a huge survival advantage in the middle of winter, because you can find stuff that you can't see. Amazing animals. They're amazing animals. This is stuff I didn't know at all. Now, caribou are probably the most important staple in an Inupiat diet, because you can get caribou all year long. You use caribou hides for your clothing, first time I realized you could actually be comfortable camping was I'd gone out with a family and they spread caribou hides on the bottom of the tent. It was like having a mattress. No, none of this waking up in the middle of the night trying to remove rocks from beneath your spine. Beautiful. Okay, and the meat's great. So that they use everything. They'll use antlers to make knife handles. They use every part of the animal. What I didn't know, well, first of all, is that the way the fur is designed, it captures the air. Because these guys do not migrate. They move, but they move along the Arctic Circle, so they're not going south. So their fur is very, very useful for staying warm because it captures the air. This is what I didn't know until a couple of years ago, that their hooves are kind of shaped like shovels. Yeah, and their hooves also are really super sharp. So what they can do, because of course they can't eat the grass, they have to eat the lichen that's underneath the snow. So the shovel is for scooping the snow away, and the pointy bits are for breaking through the crusty ice. So this whole biology is an adaptation so they can stay. This is the kind of thing I'm sure you know. This guy looks like this in the fall, same guy in the winter. Just basically, if you're going to hang around where there's snow, you better look and be vulnerable. You better hide. Now this is a new thing. This was a new thing for me. These are ground squirrels. It's what I would call prairie dogs. And they hibernate. Most rodents, apparently, like the lemmings and the field-mice, they all hibernate. But here, I've just been told that bears are starting to come out of hibernation here. Mm-hmm. Yeah, so we're bringing our cereal cakes in. Polar bears don't hibernate. Grizzly bears hibernate. Black bears, polar bears don't. But what they are doing is that because they're losing their ice habitat, they're changing their behavior. Because polar bears actually live out on the ice for most of their lives. They are maritime animals. They hunt seals. But I'm sure that you've all seen pictures, because they're so heartrending, of polar bears that are swimming out to ice that doesn't exist and then they drown. I mean, it's really, but there are a bunch of polar bears now that don't even bother to try to go out onto the ice. They stay inland. The thing that is super interesting is that they're starting to mate with grizzlies. So that is a prisley. A prisley. Another word is growler, so it's a combination of polar bear and grizzly, or grizzly and polar. But the interesting thing about this is that their young are viable, so that they can have young. So it's not like just kind of having it off on a Saturday night and that's it, you know? I mean, this is a survival strategy. I have no idea. I haven't been able to talk to a scientist about what kind of genetic change is happening or not, but that's a different kind of species. Okay. So that fourth option is not just hunker down, not just change your behavior like change your diet, but do something that actually creates a different kind of being. I think that's super interesting. And this, again, you know, it's the kind of thing you don't really think about until somebody mentions it, and then you think, holy cow, that's so interesting. One of the questions was, why is it that fish don't freeze in the winter in the Arctic? Because by all accounts, they should. But a number of these guys have a kind of antifreeze in their circulatory system. And so one of the ones that I knew about that I couldn't find a picture of is a species, their body temperature goes so low it seems like they're dead. But it's just this deep, deep hibernation, and then when the waters warm up a bit, then they kind of shake it off and come back. I can't give you a picture of this, but this guy was very interesting to me in terms of those adaptations. Okay, so now we're gonna, I started with animals because the guys that I work with are so dependent on animals that a lot of our conversations are about them. And I know that they're interesting to me too. But this is about the guys that live there in Inupiat, and that means real people. According to archaeologists, Inupiat have been living around there for several thousand years. According to one of the elders that I was talking to, he said, well, our recent history goes back 10,000 years. I don't know, yeah, but it goes back a ways. Now this is interesting. So the picture on the top is of a sod hut, which was, these guys had permanent communities. A lot of Inuit are nomadic and they're just constantly moving across the landscape. Here, because of the placement, they made permanent buildings and let the animals come to them. Yeah, so it's a sod house. It's built into the land. It's shored up by whale bones, and it's very different from. And it was heated with whale oil lamps, and it was ventilated by an opening that they called a kanak, which is a nose, which they could regulate. So they could regulate the temperature of this cold air coming in pretty well. And this is a shot from Barrow last year. So you can see that the style of housing has changed quite a lot. So one of the stories that I was told, I think this is a great story. So a long time ago, we put our houses below ground and our dead above ground. And then the white guys showed up and they taught us to put our houses above ground and our dead below ground. And we haven't been warm since. Because the other thing is that most of these houses, they don't have basements. They're built flat onto the permafrost. They are very cold. It's very, very difficult to heat them adequately. Whereas with this, you'd walk in with a single whale oil lamp and people would sort of strip down to their all-togethers. Yeah. So it was a very efficient use of their environmental resources. It's easier to get television and internet on these new ones. But the thing about that is that the houses, the sod houses, were a wonderful example of how people used, pretty much, they used the animal products, they used the soil, they used their own knowledge of how air circulates in order to build their thing. I give one of the rules that people were pretty consistent in talking about is how it's important to look, to observe. So I chose this image because a walk on the beach is one of the ways that you really do this. So here you're walking on this beach, and not only are you observing the wave action, whether or not it's going to start eating away, because coastal erosion is super intense right now. You're absolutely checking out the water line to see if you could see any marine animals, that you would be able to see a whale by its spout. You're checking out the clouds, but you're also beach combing, because any time the water comes up, you start looking to see whether you can see any ivory, what kind of, and people will constantly look at the things that they come across and say, wonder what I could use that for. So one of the things that's really interesting about the ways in which people are surrounded by their materials is that it's not this is for that, but what else could I use it for? So it's a constant, this is another form of this plasticity stuff, that nothing is fixed and everything is useful. And it's fun to watch, to walk on the beach, absolutely. So that's a woman's knife. You can tell that it's a woman's knife by its shape. A woman's knife is like that, and a man's knife is straight. And it's a fabulous tool for flensing, for cutting up seals, for sewing. Egyptians used knives with the same shape. There's something about that shape that is apparently very, very effective. I chose this one because the blade is made out of slate. So before they had iron, they had steel, and they would make handles out of absolutely anything. This is made out of bone. I saw one that, speaking of the beach combing, somebody had found a mammoth bone on the beach and turned that mammoth bone into a handle. When I've gone on walks with women, frequently they'd say, oh, this is good, I'll give this to my husband, he can make me moo with this. Antlers, all kinds of bone, all kinds of wood, driftwood, certain kinds of metal, anything that you can grasp onto that can be made beautiful is good to get. So there are lots and lots of examples of the way people use all kinds of materials, but I really like that shape, so I thought I would show it. The other thing is people's skill with sewing, which is the most important thing that a woman can do, is to sew. But it also shows a huge amount of environmental knowledge. Because here, I mean, you can tell that this parka, which is a very fancy parka, I mean, you would use this when you were going to some kind of a ceremonial event, yeah? And people still do. This is in the Smithsonian, but people still do. They'll have their squirrel parka with their sunburst hood, thank you. And just stroll into the room, you know, being, okay, you can look at this now. Because this parka is gonna take something like 50 squirrel skins. You have to trap the squirrels first in order to get them. But the skill at being able to match the different colors, that's all beautiful and that's fine. What's really the most important bit of this parka is that this rim is made out of wolverine, whereas this is going to be made out of fox, or it's going to be made out of wolf. The wolverine is sort of like the caribou stuff. It's hollow, so it catches the air. If we're talking about minus 50 degrees, and you walk out just striding along and breathe in, what you're going to do is you're going to breathe ice crystals into your lungs, and you're going to cut them. So what Inuit clothing does is to capture the air and warm it before you take it into your lungs. So it's a highly skilled technological feat as well as a really beautiful one.
Is there a story in the design on the jacket?
Not that I know of. There could be. I mean, each one of these jackets is an individual creation by the sewer, by the seamstress. And so she might pull stories into how she puts things together. She doesn't have to, but there aren't patterns. You don't have to follow somebody else's pattern to be acknowledged as a good seamstress. My friend Marie is recognized as one of the best around, but she doesn't do this. She makes these parkas with trim around. It's just incredibly beautiful. And this is a parka that's modern, because those other two were kind of 100 years old. And you can still see the wolverine with the wolf. And it's a beautiful way of framing the face, you know. Okay, so this is one other sort of technological strategy that I really want to identify. This is a skin boat, yeah? The cover is made out of walrus skins. The guys, the hunters themselves they're not in these colorful parkas because that will scare the animals away. They're a bit like the ptarmigan, no? They're covering themselves in white so they're not so visible. You use a skin boat today in the spring when there's ice. But in the fall, when it's ice-free water, you're using motorboats. Yeah. The thing that I really want to emphasize here is that there is no tension between is one thing modern and the other thing traditional, is one thing new and the other thing kind of old-fashioned. Absolutely not. What they say is, when there's ice, a skin boat is way better to navigate in because it's more flexible. You know, you're in an aluminum boat and you hit an iceberg and it kind of crunches a hole in the side of your boat, you are in serious trouble. Yeah? If you're in a skin boat and you bump up against and it tears, you've got a jar of seal blubber with you. You just take off a chunk and you plug it into the hole, because the seal fat will bind with the oils of the skin boat and seal it, which is not something you can do with a motorboat. All right. On the other hand, when there isn't any ice, this is beautiful, calm sea. But in the fall, you can be confronted with a storm really quickly. You may find that you're having to travel much further. A motorboat makes more sense. It's more effective. So the conversations that I've had, and I think this is actually really important, is that people don't get into this tension about traditional versus modern stuff. They say, well, let's test it out and see what works, you know. And nobody is ashamed of using something that was sort of pre-European, but nobody assumes that something that's coming from the marketplaces of the world has got to somehow be better than what they have. They say, let's figure out what the conditions are and let's figure out what works where. Pretty sensible, I think. So one thing that because of course we're talking about sharing, that the name of my dissertation was called "The Whales Come to Me, They Know I Share." The emphasis on the moral value of sharing is just everywhere. But what gets shared is, I think, not what you would necessarily assume. So one of the things that people are very strong about is that you need to tell what you know. That's one of the rules. Now, you talk to a commercial fisherman on the east coast of the United States about whether he shares his knowledge about the good fishing places, he'll go, you must be joking. Yeah. You go to a really good fisherman here, and he's very happy to tell you where the good places are. Yeah. What's very interesting, as a matter of fact, I mean, there are absolutely rules that guarantee access, but if you put a trap line too close to mine, I can pick it up and throw it to the side because you've impeded my access. But I can't say, this is my private property. There's no such thing as private property out in the tundra. There's the assumption is that there's plenty of space and that you can find your own trap line. Yeah. So that the rules are about guaranteeing access, they're not about exclusion. And that's pretty interesting to me as well. Because people seem to pay attention. I mean, we all know how easy it is to talk a talk and not walk the walk. Yeah. My impression is that here people are serious when they say, the animals come to me, they know I share. And that means that if I'm seen to be greedy, not only will my friends drop me, but the animals won't show up. So there's a very, very powerful kind of message that says, better not do that. You know, don't hoard. Now, Patrick Atungana was an Episcopalian minister and a really master storyteller, and he talked about the people who are like our books. So he was really talking about how important it is to recognize the knowledge that people carry with them, but that knowledge only counts if they can share it with other people. So the sharing of knowledge, super important. The sharing of the animals is probably the fundamental social thing. Yeah. And any of you who were here at that other talk, you saw this picture. This is the picture of what's called Nalukatak, which is the big feast that happens in the springtime if people have been lucky enough to catch a whale. And what you see in the center are just boxes and pans and God knows what, cartons of whale meat. And all of that meat, this would be the celebration that put on by this crew because they were the ones who happened to get this particular whale. And their job is to distribute it to everybody. But what's interesting about this is that it's not that they do. I mean, you're sitting there with your garbage bag out like this, and they'll come by and they'll say, how many people in your family? And you'll say however many people you say, and I put in however many pieces of, and then I keep going around like that. And the whole crew is doing that until there's nothing left, basically. Now, part of that whale probably was set aside to send to another community that didn't have so much luck whaling. So that sharing will include putting meat on a plane and sending it off. And part of the sharing will go into people's ice cellars. And a whaling captain and his wife are responsible for keeping track of people through the year. So if anybody is kind of ill or has lost a hunter in their family, it's their job as a whaling captain couple to go and say, do you need some meat? So that sharing goes on all year. But here, because this is the ceremony, yeah, it starts with this, people are saying grace, so it starts with the prayer, then there's a distribution, but then everybody sits down and eats together. So it's all this kind of different levels of sharing going on at one moment. And there are 3 times during the year this happens. In the spring, Nanukata, at Thanksgiving, and at Christmas. And Thanksgiving and Christmas, these distributions happen in the churches. So they're folded into, it's a Christian service. But to begin with, members of the crew will walk down the aisle and give thanks to the animals and to God. Yeah. But what's interesting about this, going back to the whole questions of light and dark, a lot of times Euro-Americans coming up go, oh my God, the darkness is driving me crazy, I'm getting cabin fever, blah, 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 blah. What's so interesting here is it's the dark time that's the social time. You go out, you have these communal things that happen. And it's the light time. The last of those communal things is here, which is in April. And then people go off on the tundra and go fishing and stuff. But it's the dark time that's the social time. And it's not the time that you get sad or mad or whatever the seasonal affect disorder thing is. And you dance. I think that Inupiat dancing is one of the best things in the world. I've occasionally gone when I, for one reason or another, hadn't had any sleep the night before. And I end up just energized. Yeah. Because there's just this community feeling. These drums, which are made out of seal intestines, and these women who are the singers, fill this space with a resonating sound that just kind of wakes you up. But that's absolutely about giving thanks to the animals. So I just want to think, I have no idea how long I've been going, but we're just about done. I want to think about some of these observations that seem to me to be kind of counterintuitive, and the counterintuitiveness of it is what was really interesting to me. But there's this notion that there's something that's going on with our ice that we don't understand. That's a kind of constant drumbeat. People are concerned about that because it's an ice-based form of living. It's not just walruses. Walruses have got to give birth on the edge of the ice so that their young can go down to the bottom of the ocean and come back up. With the ice going out, walruses are in trouble. Yeah. Polar bears are in much less trouble because they can navigate on land. But human beings this is also an ice-based culture. So there's worry about what's going on with the ice. But also saying, well, we've moved before. Coastal erosion, super big problem. But my friend George Edwardson said, yeah, but we've moved before, we can move again. So it's not just this general panic. There's some things that are anxiety provoking. There's some things that call the attention, but they start thinking, okay, what can we do about it? So what are the counterintuitive things? I think this is apt for some of the stuff that's going on today. We all recognize that knowledge is power. Yeah. For the most part, most of the tussles that I get into, and this has to do with academic knowledge as well as other political knowledge, is that you gain power by not sharing your knowledge, by keeping it keeping your cards close to your chest. Yeah. And what these guys say is, nah, that doesn't work. That knowledge is more powerful if you share it. And we could argue about that, but I think it's an interesting talking point. So when conditions get bad, it's better to share than to hoard. And that can be pretty counterintuitive. You know, in England, when a storm is coming, you don't even try to go to the grocery store because everybody will have been there before you and just plucked everything off of the shelves. And they're not going to sit there and create a community sharing spot. They're going to put it in their cellar. Yeah. So that it's a different way of thinking about responding to that. Being greedy makes you isolated. You know, and I again, when I was in England, this was during the Thatcher era, when the greed is good mantra was out there in the open. You know, and I found it incredibly difficult to kind of deal with because I'd been so strongly socialized by these guys that just wasn't. You're not a proper human if you're greedy. And then what people say is if you're too greedy, then your support systems are going to give up on you. And what I've been told is that the people who are found dead on the side of the trail are those who didn't maintain their relations. Yeah. So it's a moving away from the individual self-interest, which we all have, to a kind of a recognition that there are other ways of thinking about it. And we all know that when the hurricanes hit and when the tornadoes hit, there's a huge outpouring of communal support. You know, it's not just these guys who are capable of that, but sometimes it seems to need that sort of extreme disaster to call it up. Now this is, I think, also interesting, that when disaster strikes, the first response is not to say, whose fault is it? And we need to figure out whose fault it is because we need to decide who's going to pay for it. We've all heard that stuff. And this is interesting, I think, you know, that the response is, okay, we need to think about what we've done, not what I've done, and not what you've done, the we, so that we need to think about collective responsibility, and then about collective action as opposed to who's going to pay. So this is my last slide. This is James Nyack. He was one of my, he's the brother of Raymond, who was one of the people who really pulled me in. An amazing man who passed away a couple of years ago. He passed away from COVID. He was a gifted dancer, an amazing linguist, knew everything about Inupiat history, very funny man. But the thing that I wanted to leave with all of us is that he absolutely knew who he was, and the fact of that meant that it was easy for him to reach out to all kinds of others. You know, never got into a conversation with, well, they're not really Inupiat, so I don't need to talk to them. Yeah. And so I learned a huge amount from him about a lot of the things that I was talking about today, and many others. So I just want to end on that note of remembrance and ask you if you have any questions.